Thanks, and thanks to the contributors. Can I say to the Law Society, I very much welcome the part of your submission which suggests action should be taken to accelerate the end of direct provision, and in terms of ensuring, the resources necessary for social distancing in overcrowded housing conditions. So I just want to say that as a very positive thing. But I have two questions, really. Following everything you've said about confusion over legal requirements as against guidance, about the need for proportionality, if I understand you correctly, for things to be clearly communicated, and so on. I mean, you may know there's a motion in the Dáil to deal with Section 31A of the Health Act, which gives sweeping powers to the Minister for Health, and the statutory instrument which relates to things like gatherings in homes, limiting numbers and gathering in homes, and various other restrictions. I mean, do you think that those emergency amendments to the Health Act and that statutory instrument are problematic legally? That they sail close to the wind or beyond, if you like, the boundaries which you think need to be observed in terms of legality, constitutionality, or just ensuring that there's trust, public trust, in the laws and regulations that are being used to deal with COVID? That's my first question. And the other question I just would like sort of clarity on. I mean, I'm very much believe people should adhere to rational public health guidelines. But I also think, and a number of you have made observations about the need for the Dáil committees to function, the legal system to function, and so on. And the right to protest it seems to me, is a very important part of the functioning of our democracy. Now, I think people who recklessly sort of refuse to socially distance on protests, who don't wear masks and so on, I think is utterly reckless. But I also think it would be completely wrong, and I'm not even sure what the legal position at the moment is, to prevent protests where people do socially distance, do wear masks, given the importance of the right to demonstrate and the right to protest in a functioning democracy. So I'd just like to hear your opinions on that, and indeed what is the sort of, what's the constitutional and legal powers now in terms of, do they have the right to stop protests? I just would like your opinion. I mean, just to give you one example, I won't mention the group involved, but there was one group that was planning a protest soon that were told by the guards that if they organised a protest, they'd all be arrested. Now, this was despite the fact that they made very clear that they were going to socially distance, they were going to mask, they were going to control numbers and regulate the protest, but they were just told, no, if you go ahead, we'll arrest you. Do they actually have the power to do that? Do you think that's proportionate? Does that sort of relate to any of the concerns you've expressed? That's it. Those are my questions.
Maybe I'll just deal with part of that, if I may. Relating to on the question of public protest. I mean, public protest is an essential part of democracy, like many of the other things we're talking about here as well. And if it is to be restricted, then any restriction on it has to be necessary and proportionate, as would be required by law. Whether that is the case or not in any particular instance then becomes a matter that ultimately on evidence a court might have to decide as to whether a restriction on public protest, something which is essential to democracy, was necessary and proportionate. So I'm not really expressing a view on that. On the question, I suppose, other than talking in principle terms, in part of the Society's submission, we do have under a heading discussion on house parties, which I think is something else I think the Deputy was referring to. And the proposal to empower Gardaí to enter private dwellings with a view to enforcement of COVID-19 regulations is of some concern to the Society, we say in our submission. Criminal statutes that provide for powers of entry by the Gardaí into private dwellings generally have safeguards that require certain preconditions to be met. And again, we say the Oireachtas has generally provided that powers of entry into private dwellings are reserved for the investigation of serious offences. For example, an arrestable offence, whereby the penalty for such offences is a penalty of 5 years imprisonment or more. So, again, without expressing any definitive view on it, I conclude with a sentence from our submission which says the Society cautions against introducing powers which are normally reserved for the investigation of serious criminal offences for the purpose of enforcing what are, in effect, health regulations.
So, just very briefly then, in that regard, is SI number 326 of 2020 that deals with things like the numbers gathering in private dwellings, do you think there's at least a question mark over, you know, the legality or the constitutionality of these kind of provisions? Well,
just on that quickly, clearly the Constitution provides protections for the dwelling houses of citizens, and it's very restricted, the circumstances in which that can be violated. Again, it becomes a question for argument as to whether the power being introduced and the circumstances for which it's being introduced, whether it is a necessary and proportionate response. But as I really just pointed to, something which was in the Society's submission, which all deputies received, which is simply no more than really an expression of concern, not a definitive expression one way or another that we're for or against it. We're just saying there are these legal concerns in relation to it.
And sorry, Deputy.
Sorry, I'm out of time, am I?
You are, yeah. I'll try to bring you in at the end.
Okay. Thanks very much for your answer.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy.